Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Kimbra called Primal Heart. Man, it's been a while since I've had such mixed feelings going into an album review like this, and to explain why, we need to go all the way back to 2012. The pop charts are being overrun with out-of-nowhere indie breakthroughs, and a little song called Somebody That I Used to Know by Goche featuring Kimbra is becoming one of the biggest sleeper hits of the 2010s, and it would be the biggest hit of 2012. But Kimbra, she got her start earlier with an off-kilter brand of indie pop that took old-school glamour and then spent a debut driving noisy spikes into it. Occasionally unsettling, but frequently compelling, Vows, it was a really damn potent indie debut for her, and her collaboration with Goche seemed to give her the opening she needed to really blow up. And then in 2014, we got the Golden Echo. Now, I'll freely admit, my review of that album, not one of my best. It was back in 2014, still somewhat getting my sea legs. But the record as a whole did not hold up then, and 4 years have not improved it. Critical and commercial momentum hit a brick wall, as her characteristically unstable and overwrought production collided with R&B and 90s pop-inspired tones, muddying a lot of her usual sharp satirical edge, and her choice to stick almost entirely with her cooing, weaker upper register made an already overlong record a real chore for me to get through. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some high points that made it at least interesting and compelling, but it's a little bit understandable that it's been 4 years since that album, and there were some major shakeups in the production staff since, bringing on John Congleton as a major co-producer, and also getting credits from Natasha Bedingfield and Skrillex of all people. And considering how often this album has been pushed back, I didn't really have high expectations. But I at least hope Kimbra could make a return to form, especially as Vows has held up to this day. I've gone back to it since, it's still really good. So okay, what do we get with Primal Heart? Well, honestly, I'm not sure if it's right to call this a return to form, especially as thematically so much about this album is about never going back. But the time away from the spotlight apparently did Kimbra a fair amount of good, because this is a pretty good, pretty likable album. Not quite great or on the same level as Vows, at least for me, but for a certain step forward towards a more controlled sound that takes the messy eccentricities that made the Golden Echo so frustrating and then refines them into a tighter, more rewarding sound. And it's genuinely surprising the record isn't getting more attention for that, because yeah, this is gonna get underrated by a lot of people. It's really quite good. Now, granted, part of that might be because Kimbra is still a tough artist for some people to really appreciate. And to some extent, the mess of contradictions of her persona, they're still somewhat visible on this album, starting with a lot of her delivery. Now, to her credit, she does spend a lot more time on this album in her richer, lower register, and when she does move towards the higher note, she uses some well-placed multi-tracking that can lead to some really beautiful vocal arrangements, like the breathy cushion of Like They Do on the TV, or the cooing backdrop of the vintage pop leanings of Past Love, or the shimmering mid-80s synth-heavy R&B hooks of Right Direction and Everybody Knows. Easily the high points and best songs on this album. But at the same time, when she doesn't have some of that multi-track cushion, well, songs like Recovery, they do remind me a little of her earlier work where the vocal production is more sparse, and I do like her vocal timbre, but songs like Light Years demand some belting that she just cannot deliver without that significant presence. And when she's opposite more of Skrillex's heavier production on Top of the World with flows that are trending more towards a mainstream trap sound, I'm sorry, she just does not have the weight in her voice to convincingly pull off that brand of hype at that point of a register. And while I'm on the topic of nitpicking and issues that don't work here, whenever this record starts trending towards a more modern brand of pop with a bassy low end, the snaps, the sparse hi-hats and snares like the Good War and Human, even if in the latter case where she's given a little bit more space to really breathe and flex her vocals, it's also touching on a tone that just does not have the same color or flair as what Kimbra can bring to the table more effectively. Now, I'll say it, as much as Top of the World sounds like a mainstream version of a Tune-Yard song, when Kimbra actually introduces the blocky slices of synth that blow the song wide open, it might be more abrasive for some listeners, especially against the more ethereal backing vocals. Honestly, it's what makes the song far more distinctive and memorable for me. That's when it started getting good. And really, many of these songs are the exception to the primary tonal palette of this album. Spiky, low-end grooves, glossy, buzzing synths, and razor-tight layering with the aid of John Congleton that reminds me a lot more of the early to mid-80s synth pop or mid-80s R&B, or artists like Shura, Churches, and especially Carly Rae Jepsen that call upon that retro sound. And really, with songs like Everybody Knows, Right Direction, the darker, spacey echoes of Black Sky with that tight low end, or even the deeply restrained minimalism of Version of Me, Kimbra proves more than capable of playing in this lane with just enough of a flair for off-kilter tuning or melody to own it effectively. Hell, look at how the keys on Like They Do on the TV could have come from an Arca song, and they're set up against saxophone and noisier synths that are decidedly Kimbra's own. That's her coming to the table. Now, of course, one of the biggest draws for Kimbra for me is a lot of the content and the songwriting, and also where I think a lot of people will not give this record the credit it deserves. Now, there's always been a satirical side to much of Kimbra's work, but what gives Primal Heart its power is how that satire is often turned inwards on herself and is a little more introspective. Likely her most self-critical, and by far her most self-aware record to date. Top of the World is the most obvious case, where her bragging feels increasingly flimsy and deconstructed as she realizes that she's been sold a chase and a progression where she's bound to be torn down even despite the fans that are praying for her success. But even a song before that, she confesses her own insecurities surrounding the potential path she could be on and the message that she could be bringing. And even while she might point fingers at those who tried to exploit her, and everybody knows it's pretty damn effective just being a straightforward kiss-off in that lane, it works for just that. What's very telling is the usage of the pronoun you across most of this record. It's intended as partially referring to herself, or at the very least her artistic persona and ego. It makes the breakup songs less about an unknown partner and more about coping with your distance from your past trajectory, especially when you really don't have a clear idea of where you're gonna go now. And that's one of the big reasons the ambiguity of these songs actually has some weight with me. While confronting the primal core of one's own ego on Human is framed as deeply intimidating, borderline fearful, why the artificial distance from her emotions on Light Years is so frenetic, why she acknowledges the distance that she's put forward from her emotions towards her past. It's all artificial on Recovery, but at the core, it's an artificiality that's somewhat necessary, because you can't change the past, you can't go back, and you have to keep moving forward, regardless of how agonizing or confusing that might be. And it's also why the final third of this album and finding some sort of reconciliation with that past is so heartbreaking. And with songs like Version of Me, shows Kimbra more vulnerable than she's ever allowed herself to be. Now, granted, you can make the argument that said vulnerability might have more weight if presented towards somebody else and not just herself, but if you're on board for this arc, the delivery still brings real weight. She can sell this sort of song, and that's what makes the chilly, auto-tuned acapella of the final song Real Life connect for me. It might be artificial to keep moving forward like this and keep pressing on, certainly lack some of that self-destructive glamour of past life, but really, if she's being honest, it's necessary all the same. But in short, I think this record will have to grow on a lot of people, because there are confessional layers to this project that those not willing to take Kimbra seriously, they will not see it. And part of it is because, by design, the album's transitional. But Kimbra's poise and her execution of that transition makes not just for one of her most accessible records to date, but arguably her most heartfelt and her most intimate, along with some of her best ever hooks and songs. So yeah, for me, I'm thinking a 7 out of 10. Definitely recommend it if you want to hear what Kimbra is up to years after the Golden Echo and somebody that I used to know, even longer after that mainstream spotlight has faded. And definitely a sort of artist that I'm happy to see back on the stage. So yeah, even if nobody else cares, I still dig this. Definitely check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm not sure how many people are gonna care about Kimbra dropping a new album, but hey, if you want to buy it, and I recommend you do, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where diehard Kimbra fans fall on this. I'm still not sure it's better than Vows, I don't think it is, but I still think it's worthwhile checking out. It's still pretty damn good, and I think it's gonna get underrated by a lot of people. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I cover these records earlier, link to my Patreon right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even the top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. You want to see a schedule, it's on my Instagram, link below. Until next time, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.